has been brought to you by the letter A.
Okay, welcome to the very first edition of the ABCs of Archaeology. And where else would we start but the letter A? And what else would we start with but A for archaeology? So let's actually begin this by saying what archaeology definitely is not. First, archaeology is not treasure hunting. In fact, most times you're lucky if you find some potsherd and maybe some pieces of bone. Number two, archaeology is definitely not finding stuff to put in a museum.
That belongs in a museum. So do you.
That's a really old school style of thinking. In fact, most archaeological material stays right in the ground. Number three, archaeology is not paleontology. Paleontology is digging up dinosaurs. Archaeologists don't deal with dinosaurs. Number four, archaeology is not architecture. That is the designing of buildings and structures. And number five, archaeology is not geology. That's the study of rocks.
You are now the proud new owner of your very own pet rock.
So what actually is archaeology? Well, archaeology in some places, especially the US, is considered a subdiscipline of anthropology. Other places it's its own thing or part of history or part of classics. So it's parked in a few different places. Now, the classic definition is the study of humans and societies through the material record, the material remains of those past societies. So we're talking about stuff. And there's a lot of stuff that people normally think of when they think of archaeology, like buildings, weapons, armor, that sort of thing. But there's a lot of other things you wouldn't normally think of that we find in archaeology. We find human bones and soft tissues and hair, DNA, hello. We find wooden objects, and a lot of these things you wouldn't think would survive, like cloth. And they tend to do well in particularly dry environments like Egypt. That's why we find so much old stuff there. Or counterintuitively in waterlogged environments like bogs and swamps. So there's a whole collection of perfectly preserved bodies from thousands of years ago all over Northern Europe that were preserved in swamps. It's some pretty cool stuff. Now, there's whole categories of other kinds of remains that aren't really human-made, but they're more like human-influenced. And that gives rise to a whole bunch of sub-branches of archaeology that most people have never heard of. There's bioarchaeology. That's the study of all kinds of biological remains at archaeological sites, like bones or other tissues and plant remains. And within bioarchaeology, there's zooarchaeology, which is particularly animals. Animals are in the wild, but a lot of them are pets of people, beasts of burden, even parasites. There's archaeobotany. That's the study of plants, and a lot of the traces of human cultivation and farming and other practices are evident in the plants that we find at sites. Diet, of course, as well. There's ethnoarchaeology. That's almost like being an anthropologist. It's the study of groups of people to try to find equivalents for comparisons in the archaeological record. That sounds a little bit complicated. We'll get to it in a later episode. There's archaeoastronomy. That's basically studying the movement of the planets and stuff going on in the sky to try to make assertions about places like Stonehenge matching up with solar eclipses or other things lining up with points in the sky. That's been really important in the study of certain sites and objects, which I'm sure we'll talk about. There's one of my favorites, which is experimental archaeology. That's kind of like testing stuff out, making things to see how they work, how they might have been made, could they have been made at that time, how they may have been used, how did that build that house, how did they make that pot. It's making and doing stuff in the modern day to try to find clues in the past.
Oh, so that's what Bunsonian does.
And there's landscape archaeology. That's studying how humans influence the land and how the land influences them. So the situations of villages, which happen in somewhat regular patterns in different regions, or where roads are put, or what are signs for cultivation in different ages in the landscape. Archaeology is also an academic discipline. It's not just digging stuff in the ground. So, like any academic discipline, it has a lot of theory and research that goes into it. Now, just like international relations, that's something I've studied. They have a few different theoretical schools. They've got realism, they've got liberalism, they've got neorealism. Or economics, that's something else I've studied. You have Keynesianism and monetarism. Archaeology has certain schools of thought. Now, it started out with antiquarianism, which is really not much of a thing anymore. It was basically rich old guys who went to Egypt or dug in their backyard for a hobby. Not a lot of practices or theory going on there. The first one, after archaeology kind of became an actual discipline, was culture history. This is sort of the old school style of archaeology you'd recognize from Indiana Jones, people studying particular cultures and periods of time, and just kind of classifying things, giving them a date range, trying to figure out where that fits out in history. This is actually widely disparaged nowadays because it was a good way of characterizing and categorizing things, but not really giving a lot of answers. However, it's actually what most archaeologists do every day when they're digging in the field and finding things and categorizing them for placement in the relevant context. Next, in the 1960s, there was something called new or processual archaeology. That happened in the context of all these revolutions going on all over the world, real and in academia. That was about trying to introduce science-testable hypotheses into archaeology so that it stood up to other disciplines that were more in the hard sciences area. And finally, we have post-processualism, which came about in the 1980s. Now, the post-processualists were reacting to the new archaeology or processualism, which they saw as being an over-scientificization, if I can use that word, of archaeology. Now, the post-processualists knew that you use hard sciences in archaeology, and that's a very, very important tool set, but that they thought the new archaeologists sort of took people out of the archaeology. They thought that when you see this pot structured that way, or this building built that way, or this site arranged that way, a lot of the reason for that is inside people's head. So it involves things like ideology, religion, even psychology. So post-processualism isn't really one kind of strand, it's an umbrella. And various strains of post-processualists emphasize different frames like Marxism or feminism or phenomenology or psychology and cognition. So they went out in a lot of different directions. Some of it's pretty hokey, but a lot of it, when you see the kinds of interpretations they came up with, make a lot of sense. But whatever theoretical frame you're coming from, or if you don't even have one, ultimately what archaeology is, it's about telling stories. It's looking at this site and trying to sort of be a detective and figure out what was going on here. Why was it going on? What did it mean? So ultimately what archaeologists are storytellers.
Oh, a bullshit artist.
Okay, yeah, they're kind of that too. But as you can see from our talk about theory, it's a little more than that, and you have to have good evidence behind your BS. So A is for archaeology. I'll see you next time when we get to. I don't want to kill the surprise. I'll let you figure out what comes after A. Until the next time, bye-bye. Hey, if you like what you heard, give me that thumbs up below, hit that bell to subscribe, or if you want to support more independent archaeology content, consider contributing to my Patreon, where you can enjoy some exclusive members-only benefits and other goodies. Until the next dig. Subscribe, or if you want to support more independent archaeology content, consider contributing to my Patreon, where you can enjoy some exclusive members-only benefits and other goodies. Until the next dig.